It's been nearly 3 weeks since Valve officially launched the Steam Deck, and now, finally, I'm ready to put my final review judgment on it. There have been a lot of updates to this ambitious handheld gaming PC in that time, but what I was mainly waiting for is the graphics driver that allows us to put it through its paces as a standard Windows PC and sidestep the limitations of Valve's Linux-based SteamOS. We have that now, and the Steam Deck has smoothed out some of its launch issues too. So, how good is it? Well, when the stars align, this chunky little handheld can do some absolutely impressive thing, putting a pretty powerful little PC in the palm of your hands. However, given how many popular games just don't work on Steam Deck right now, it has a long way to go towards achieving the goal of truly letting you take your Steam library anywhere. It never lets you forget that it's really a PC, and it just isn't as smooth as an experience with a walled garden console might provide. As you've already seen from the memes, this thing is pretty massive. It's 11.7 inches from end to end, which is more than 2 inches longer than a Switch. And at 1.5 pounds, it is quite a bit heavier. The size difference is enough that going back to my Switch after using the Steam Deck exclusively for a few days makes the Switch feel like a micro console. It may be a handheld, but there is no way it is going to fit in a pocket unless Jenko jeans come back, which they might. Still, the Steam Deck isn't uncomfortable to hold, and it's not like my arms get tired from holding it for a couple of hours. This one right here, this is the high-end 512GB version with 457.9 gigabytes of usable space, which runs for $649 and comes with an anti-glare screen. It also comes in a respectable 256GB and the hilariously small 64GB sizes for $529 and $399 respectively. And for that tiny one, you're definitely going to need to make use of the micro SD slot to expand the storage, unless you only want to use this expensive machine to play little tiny indie games, which, hey, whatever. The Steam Deck's 7-inch LCD touchscreen runs at 1200 by 800 at 60 Hz, and it looks really good. That said, the OLED on the latest Nintendo Switch model has kind of spoiled me on handheld screens, and the Steam Deck doesn't live up to that level of vibrance and clarity. But unless you're going from one to the other, it's not bad at all. The outer shell might not be the sexiest looking tech ever built, but it has a subtle texture to it, somewhat rougher than the texture of an Xbox controller, and it feels good to the touch. The grips on either side bulge out at the edges, making it much more comfortable to hold in my adult-sized hands than a Nintendo Switch. The main buttons feel like little pieces of flawlessly smooth hard candy with nice travel and just enough resistance. I'm not as into the D-pad, which feels well built, but it's just a little mushier than I like, and the way it's positioned to the left of the thumbstick, it threw me off a little bit. I can live with it. It's just a little odd. The thumbsticks, though, they're my favorite feature of the Steam Deck. They're perfectly smooth without feeling loose or sloppy, and they revert back to center with a satisfying snappiness. The surface is touch sensitive, so it knows when you've got a thumb on one without needing to depress anything. I didn't have any issues with them, but knowing that they're technically user replaceable makes me sleep easier, considering they're actually built into the Steam Deck rather than detachable like the Switch's Joy-Cons. Directly below each thumbstick is a trackpad with a subtle but slick haptic feedback that feels like moving a mouse across my desk. It feels good for desktop applications and navigating in the Steam menus, and it'll feel very familiar to anyone who used a Steam controller. Between these and the touchscreen, the Steam Deck has most of its bases covered when it comes to inputs. And like just about everything else with the Steam Deck, you can turn them on or off on a per game basis, which is good because sometimes I accidentally hit them and move the camera when I didn't want to, and then I die and then I get really mad. Shoulder buttons also feel good, although the L2 and R2 triggers are much better than the L1 and R1 bumpers. The bumpers feel alright once you actuate them, and in fact have a lovely little click, but to get to that point feels a little softer than I would have liked. The triggers, on the other hand, they are perfect. They're not quite as good as the DualSense, but they travel very smoothly and have just the right amount of tension. The way they spring back almost reminds me of the GameCube controller, but not quite. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. The back of the Steam Deck has 4 programmable buttons, similar to the button placement you find on the Xbox Elite and other high-end controllers. They're probably my least favorite inputs of the bunch. The placement is just difficult for me to grasp with my larger than normal hands. On top of placement, they feel bad. The response is soft and the clickiness is weak. Because of these limitations, I didn't use them for anything, which is great, since they're entirely optional. The USB-C port is located at the top of the Steam Deck near the power button. It's kind of a bummer there's only one, because that means you're probably going to want a powered USB-C hub to connect things like Ethernet, HDMI out, external storage, or any wired peripherals, while you're still plugged into power, of course. The volume up and down buttons are on the left side, and sitting between them is the Steam Deck's primary cooling vent. It pumps out a continuous stream of heat, because most of the time, the fans are running at their highest setting. It's not so loud you can't hear the pretty nice pair of forward-facing speakers over it, but I find it's impossible to ignore the high-pitched whine. The user interface is a modified version of the Steam desktop app you're used to, especially if you've used big picture mode. Navigation, fairly easy, although things as simple as locating your library aren't very intuitive at first. Where things get tricky is when you're in a game. The Steam button on the left and the menu button on the right both bring up overlays, with the menu button having notifications, performance options, and quick settings. The Steam button brings up a more detailed list of submenus, including home, library, power options, and more. This is on top of the menus in games brought up with the pause and select buttons you're used to using. The confusing part for me came when I wanted to turn off the gyro feature in Sekiro. I couldn't remember, is that an in-game setting or a Steam setting? I went through all the possibilities, and it turns out it's none of the above. It's accessed through the game menu that complements the settings menu when you hit the Steam button. It's as clear as mud. Mud's not clear. One advantage consoles have always had over PCs is that developers know exactly what hardware and software you're running on and can tune their games precisely to run well on that, whereas PCs are all over the place. But since every Steam Deck has the exact same specs other than storage space, Valve has been able to create a new badge for games that work great on Steam Deck. There are currently more than 1,000 that have earned the designation, and the list is growing every day as Valve continues to test. I have had a handful of crashes playing games that earned the seal of approval, but by and large, my experience has been great when playing recent games like God of War, Sekiro, Doom, and Deathloop. They all run at good, stable frame rates, and it's delightful having so much power in my hands. Even the brand new Elden Ring ran surprisingly well, holding around 45 FPS on default graphics settings. Games with this icon have been tested and will work, but with some caveats, like fonts that are too tiny to easily read on a 7-inch screen. Stellaris is a great example of this. Infinite gameplay possibilities, itty-bitty reading space. Everything else, well, it's a crapshoot. And the Steam Deck takes some bad beats when it comes to some hugely popular PC games that just don't work. After some messing around in the compatibility settings, I was able to play GTA 5, and it is amazing on Steam Deck. However, Fortnite, Destiny 2, Lost Ark, and Halo Infinite, for example, are nixed by a lack of anti-cheat support on SteamOS. Being able to install Windows finally cleared up some of those bigger compatibility issues with games that aren't on Steam. Your Epic Game Store library is totally playable, along with Game Pass for PC, Battle.net, Ubisoft's Uplay, you name it. It's a PC, remember? But after booting up Fortnite on its recommended graphics settings, I'm not entirely sure you'd want to play. Even though everything was set to its lowest possible option with a frame rate cap of just 30 FPS, it still didn't look great. Also, the swap to Windows is not without its drawbacks. Quickly accessing SteamOS benefits like system-level gyro control and the ability to suspend your games are gone when running in Windows, and the performance in games is generally slightly worse than in SteamOS. I will say, I was impressed by Halo Infinite running in Windows on Steam Deck. Every setting was low, but it still looked great on that small little screen, and it ran surprisingly well. But all things considered, unless you feel like you absolutely need to play games that aren't supported by SteamOS, I wouldn't recommend installing Windows, at least not for gaming. There's also a massive problem with battery life while running Windows on Steam Deck. Even when plugged into power, the battery still runs down while playing games. I even swapped out the default Steam Deck USB-C power brick for the MacBook Pro's 80-watt power brick and still saw battery drawdown while plugged into power. When running just on battery, playing 5 minutes of Halo Infinite took the charge from 55% down to 49% in 5 minutes of play. 6% of battery was lost. I'm just saying. In SteamOS, at least, I never had a problem with the battery discharging while it was plugged in, but battery life still wasn't great, especially if you aren't willing to make a lot of sacrifices. On its default settings, God of War chewed through a 100% charged battery in just 90 minutes, which falls short of the minimum 2 hours Valve advertised. Sure, we'll be able to tune games to pace themselves a little better than that, such as by limiting them to 30 frames per second rather than 60, but it was surprising how fast it went. Also, it gave me no warning at all that the battery was about to die. It just died. The other buzzkill is that even on the high-end Steam Deck, loading times can get extreme. God of War took nearly a full minute to get me into the action, and Deathloop was 2.5 minutes from the moment I pushed play. Smaller stuff like Hades pops up in under 10 seconds at least. The Steam Deck might be running off an SSD, but it doesn't hold a candle to a PS5 or Xbox Series X in that department. One area where the Steam Deck does behave more like a console than a PC is in how it lets you suspend a game at any time and then just resume. Just put the Steam Deck to sleep, go about your business, turn it back on, and you're in the game once again. That worked every time for me, which is great. However, there's only a few games that support dynamic cloud sync right now, and it's not nearly as seamless as I was expecting. The feature is supposed to let you suspend on deck and then resume from the same spot on your desktop, but Dead Cells simply loaded from the continue option on the home screen, which would at least drop me in at my last autosave, but I was expecting something a little more dynamic. I'm not sure how this is any different from regular cloud sync. It's interesting to contemplate that with just a few accessories, the Steam Deck could be someone's only PC, and that wouldn't be a terrible setup. While Linux might seem intimidating, even if you were to run SteamOS in desktop mode, you'd find it pretty familiar and much easier to use than you might think. Non-gaming applications take respectful sips from the battery, unlike games, which chug battery like some electrified frat boy. We got over 8 hours of battery life from PC Mark X Professional, making it on par or better than a lot of low-cost productivity laptops. When you factor in all that vast multi-use capability, the extra cost above a Switch, which by the way, to this day still has no web browser or Netflix app, it doesn't seem unreasonable. When the Steam Deck is living up to its promises, it is absolutely incredible. Playing GTA 5, God of War, and other modern games on the go is an absolute joy, and the hardware and controls feel good to hold, even though it is a big old chunky boy of a handheld. It seriously impressed me with how nice some demanding modern games look on its 7-inch screen. But those dizzying highs are all too often snapped away by insurmountable compatibility issues with SteamOS, and installing Windows to get around those comes with its own set of problems. I've lost count of how many times I've been left frustrated and annoyed to have to troubleshoot issues when trying to play a game for the first time. Battery life is also another major buzzkill. If you're not careful with each game's settings, you can blow through a full charge faster than a train ride from Boston to Manhattan. Sure, it'll last you a lot longer if all you want to play is low-power indies, but in that case, the Switch is a smoother experience for less money. So while I can certainly recommend the Steam Deck with some major caveats, including a noisy fan and comparably long loading times, I'm definitely not as head over heels in love with it as I hoped I'd be when I first opened the box. For more tech talk, be sure to check out our Budget to Best video series, and for everything else, keep it right here on IGN.